welcome to the ARMA International web seminar titled Grant Thornton Presents SharePoint plus NextPage. It is my pleasure to introduce your speakers today, Cindy Tetro of NextPage and Sean Ivey of Grant Thornton. Cindy is the CMO of NextPage. She's responsible for product management, product marketing, and corporate marketing, while Sean is the Director of Information. He leads the firm's information management initiatives, including enterprise content management, knowledge management, enterprise search, and collaboration. So Cindy, if you're there, the floor is all yours.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us today. We thought we'd just jump right in. 2 slides here where we just wanted to also not only provide you with Grant Thornton's case study, but also give you a little bit of context around the macro conditions that are creating the need to drive solutions like what Grant Thornton has done. And there's 2 big drivers that we tend to see in the market that are creating the need for this solution. The first one is around this increased obligation to control. And in addition to that, we're seeing it's becoming more and more difficult to actually control information on the edge. So as represented by the answers to some of those poll questions, all of us recognize that there is a lot of information that's sitting out on the edge. It's estimated that there are about 7.5 billion Office documents created annually, and 80% of those end up sitting on shared drives and individual users' hard drives. And as we get more and more computing power, we put less and less in the center. Majority of users' documents are sitting with them. They're on their personal machines. They're taking them with them. They're making decisions around those. And because all of those tens of thousands and billions of documents are sitting outside the centralized systems, it becomes very difficult to control that information and figure out how to manage it for the enterprise. In addition to that, we're also faced with an increasing unfriendly legal climate. We have new regulations that are coming into play. We have new requirements that are getting put on us, not only from the regulatory side, but even from customer contract side. We have a number of customers who work in the professional services field, and in some of those instances, they have clients who are asking them in their contracts and requiring them to actually state what will happen at the end of an engagement and how they will go through and clean up the working draft of documents. Just as an example, for another client, as we were profiling some of their users, they found that for every 1 document that they ended up with 32 permutations, and they ended up with thousands of documents created over the course of a handful of months by a few people. And those documents across the entire organization are creating a massive amount of risk, and they're very, very difficult to control. And in addition to that, when you drill down and we start to look at the cost of those unmanaged documents, we find that there's 2 big elements that play into controlling unmanaged documents. It's the cost to the enterprise and the risk. And everyone on the call in that poll question, we answered that similarly, that we have a driving need to drive compliance to current policies, but the cost and risk of that is varied across the organization and is a big concern. This is a couple of examples on the cost of storage side. We're finding that the cost of storage, the need for storage, is doubling every 2 to 3 years. And so although we hear a lot that storage is cheap, the decreasing cost of storage is not outpacing the need for storage. On average, it costs about $24,000 per terabyte of data. And then when you move that data and you get faced with an e-discovery, the average cost of review for a terabyte of data is about $1.5 million. There's a very popular case study out there from DuPont that talks about their review of a past litigation. When they reviewed that past litigation, they found that they had 70 million responsive documents. And 39 million of those documents they found were documents that should have been disposed of according to policy that they ended up reviewing. And the cost to just review those documents was about $12 million. So the cost when it hits the discovery side becomes very, very expensive. It's estimated that about 1/3 of all documents contain some sort of legally sensitive information. And for the average company that has over $1 billion in revenue, they're faced with approximately 147 litigations a year. And all of those contribute to the cost side of the equation for the enterprise. And then you also still have the risk side, whether that's a document that should have been disposed of according to policy that stays around, whether that's the risk of reputation depending on what analysis had to get done inside of there. And both of those are we're seeing becoming huge drivers for addressing this equation in today's economy. The diagram that you see there to the left talks about profiling across a large number of customers. And what we found is that in the average organization, about 80% of all information out there should be deleted. Now, I've talked to a number of organizations who have actually said, no, in our organization, it's like 95%. But for the majority of organizations, at least 80% of the data should be deleted. And there's about 15% that most organizations are okay that employees and people can keep. It's a business model that you want to be able to reuse. It's final documents that got used for a project or that got sent to a customer. And then the organization is fine if they keep those. They'd just like to know who has those and where they exist. And then there's another 5% of information that must be kept, that is records of the organization. But that leaves 95% of the data that's hanging out there on users' machines, in their environments, and that is really outside the control of the organization. And that's where the majority of cost is. In the past, as we've looked at records management, it's really addressing that 5% of the documents that must be kept, and there's still this 95% of information that sits outside of the enterprise that has to be controlled. And that's really where I'm going to turn the time over to here, Sean, so he can share with you as how they looked at this problem and the challenges that they faced and how they came up with a solution to really address all aspects of this inside of their organization. And with that, Sean, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sid. I appreciate that. Oops. We both pushed the button at the same time. First of all, let me just say I appreciate everyone's participation and interest today. This is an area and a topic that I've spent a fair amount of my time over the past few years focused on and have a fair amount of passion around. In case you didn't see in the introduction, let me just briefly introduce myself. I do work for Grant Thornton here in the U.S. I'm based out of Chicago. My primary role is to effectively run information management programs for the firm. So that includes, for us at least, things like enterprise content management and knowledge management programs. And from an IT perspective, I actually report to the CIO, but I'm closely aligned with our legal and compliance groups as we've focused, obviously, on some of the topics that we'll talk about here today. Obviously, from Grant Thornton, as you see here on the slide, was just looking through the attendee list, and I see a few familiar names up there. I know some other professional services firms are probably represented on the call today. Appreciate your attendance. For those who are unfamiliar with Grant Thornton, we are one of the larger accounting firms in the world. Here in the U.S., we have just over 50 offices and several thousand U.S.-based employees, but like most accounting firms, we're a loosely coupled organization internationally with member firms in many countries around the world. So what I'd like to spend most of my time over the next few minutes talking about is a little bit more detail in regards to the business problem in particular that we set out to address, actually going back 2 or 3 years now. So if you look at this challenges slide, this actually for us started, as I said, maybe 2 or 3 years ago when we sat down as a firm and recognized that we had some significant opportunities. In particular, we were spending a significant amount of money from an e-discovery perspective. For example, and as is the case in any kind of highly regulated industry like accounting, anytime we got involved or get involved in any sort of litigation matter, the process of e-discovery for us is probably not that different from most organizations, where we obviously have to go through a process of gathering what we think is relevant information to that case, and we leverage outside counsel to actually sift through all of that information in order to find, obviously, what's relevant. And given the rates and the costs associated with that e-discovery process, you can take a single matter and we're spending a very significant amount of money. The reason, of course, that that was very, very high, at least in our case, was due to the fact that we were not doing as much as we should have in regards to effectively managing all of that content that ultimately becomes relevant in a litigation kind of environment. We have, as an accounting firm, as most accounting firms, of course, whether it's audit or whether it's tax or whether it's advisory types of engagements, we, of course, have thousands of those engagements taking place every year. And, of course, within any one of those engagements, you can imagine that there are, in most instances, hundreds, if not thousands, of documents that get collected through the course of a normal engagement, whether that's a 2-month or 3-month or 6-month engagement. There's a tremendous amount of information that gets collected and shared and stored, to Sydney's point, in lots of different locations. And for us, it was a lot of those same locations. It was shared drives, it was hard drives, it was email. We, at that point, hadn't implemented any stringent document management system, and therefore, the practice around how documents were shared and managed and stored was inconsistent at best. So let me move on here really quickly. If you take a look at what our typical engagement process looks like, this is kind of how we approached the problem, right? We said we're spending way too much money. We need to find ways to control costs. And just as important, if not more important, we obviously needed to find ways to improve or enhance our compliance with existing policy around these work papers. We took a close look at how we actually conduct engagements, and you can see on the slide a very straightforward and fairly standard approach, but it allowed us to kind of evaluate where we collect and create information, evaluate where that information goes during the course of a normal engagement, and evaluate at the end of an engagement, of course, what happens with all of that information, those hundreds, if not thousands of documents that get created and spread around. And as our CIO is apt to say on many occasions, we do a great job of creating information, but we do a horrible job of actually getting rid of information. And I think that's probably typical of most organizations. It's human nature to be a little bit nervous about getting rid of information, particularly if you're in a professional services environment where professionals are obviously motivated to move from one engagement to the next. If there's a fair amount of effort and or time involved with that cleanup process, your problem is exacerbated in the sense that it's just that much harder to get people to actually go back through all of those documents, find everything that's relevant, and then find everything that's not relevant and make sure that we're getting rid of those things. So we found fairly consistently across all of our practices and across the entire firm that despite the fact that we had good policy in place, we didn't have good consistent enforcement of that policy. And frankly, we didn't really have good visibility into exactly what was being created, where it was ending up. And even though we did a fair job of finding the final work product from these engagements and archiving and applying retention policy to those work product, everything else just kind of we didn't have good visibility, and we didn't really know what was happening with all of that stuff. So we began at that point to take a look at how we might approach this problem to again better address the issues of compliance and again better address the issues of cost